In our solar system, Venus and Mars are the two planets that are closest to Earth. Venus is at an average distance of 134 million kilometers, while Mars is almost 3 times farther at nearly 400 million kilometers. That is 1,000 times as far as the Moon. Yet, to the Soviets, it didn't make that much of a difference. They wanted to be first everywhere. On the Moon, on Venus, on Mars, and everywhere else. We've already had an episode about the Soviet unmanned moon missions. Now let's see what they did to Venus and to Mars. My name is Alex Deva, and you're listening to the Soviet Space Saga. It is difficult to conceptualize the distances involved in flying to another planet, even if it is one of the closest ones to us. One way to think about it is that Mars, for example, is 22 light minutes away from us. So, if you had a powerful telescope and you could see someone standing on Mars, you would actually see 22 minutes into their past, because that's how long light from Mars would need to reach your eyes. Other people prefer systems of measurement that they're more familiar with, and that's when we turn to Formula One cars. At its highest top speed, a Formula One car would need 120 years non-stop to ride the distance between Earth and Mars. Add to that the fact that Venus and Mars are moving targets, as is the Moon. Trying to hit a target at 395 million kilometers while it's flying at 87,000 kilometers per hour requires rather precise calculations. And it seems incredible that the Soviets, with their rudimentary computer, singular, were able to make them already by the late 1950s. With distances so vast, it nearly didn't matter if it was 100 million kilometers or 400 million. The Soviets went for Mars first, even though it was much farther than Venus. One of the reasons was that landing on Mars had higher chances of success than landing on the much hotter Venus. In fact, Mars missions were already talked about while Sergei Korolev was investigating jet propulsion before the war, and without the blessing of the Communist Party. But by 1959, Korolev was finally in a position to continue with full state support. Filled with ambition, the Soviets planned for nothing less than to send people to Mars. They were working on a new rocket for that, which was even bigger and more powerful than the R-7. It was called the N-1. As too often in the history of their space program, 2 different design bureaus were tasked with coming up with solutions for manned missions to Mars. Work on putting a Soviet cosmonaut on Mars was carried on in earnest for a few years. A spacecraft that was 20 meters long and 4 meters in diameter was designed, with plans to build it in orbit out of 2 pieces that would be flown up there separately. Looking back, it's perfectly possible to interpret the Soviet work on manned missions to Mars as what will eventually lost them the space race. While they were busy gazing at Mars, on the other side of the world, NASA had just received an order, backed by an unbelievable amount of money, to aim at the Moon instead. By the time the Soviets realized that the race would be happening somewhere else, it may have been too late. Still, work continued on missions to Mars and to Venus, but the decision was made to only send unmanned automatic probes, and this was difficult enough in itself. Besides the problem of calculating the trajectory, they had to figure out the rocket and the spacecraft. For the rocket, they decided on an improved R7 that had a whole new fourth stage. Its name was Molnia, which in Russian means lightning. As for the spacecraft, a big cylinder with 2 solar panels was quickly designed. It contained 3 instruments out of a total of 5 that were initially planned. The television system was among the systems to be taken off because they were too heavy. The first attempt to send a probe to Mars took place on October the 10th, 1960. The launch didn't go too well. Exactly 5 minutes into the flight, with the rocket 120 kilometers above the Earth, there was a failure in the control system which led to the shutdown of the third stage. It took half a minute to decide that things were beyond rescue, and the self-destruct command had to be sent. 4 days later, an almost identical rocket with an almost identical spacecraft were launched again. Once again, the third stage failed, this time due to a problem that had actually occurred before the launch. Some liquid oxygen had leaked and caused the fuel to freeze. Rocket and spacecraft ended up burning in the atmosphere. Unlike orbital flights, which can be launched more or less any time, when you aim for a whole different planet, there are only a few windows of opportunity available, when the 2 planets, Earth and the destination, are at their closest. For that reason, Mars had to wait. So the Soviets took out the trajectory calculations for Venus and aimed at that instead. The Russian name for planet Venus is Venera, and with characteristic imagination, that's what they called their spacecraft when they were aiming them at Venus. The first launch window was calculated to be in the beginning of February 1961, but the launch failed again. Instead of ending up on Venus as it was meant to, the spacecraft ended up in Siberia. A big chunk of it sank in a small river there, where a young boy discovered it by accident. He gave it to his dad, who gave it to the police, who gave it to the KGB, who sent it to Moscow, who then sent it back to Korolev, who must have had some conflicting feelings about seeing it again. But this probe also had a sister probe, which was launched about a week later. Finally, nothing went wrong with the launch, and so Venera 1 became the first spacecraft ever launched to another planet in human history. Venera 1 was a 2 meters long metal cylinder with a diameter of 1 meter. It had a dome on top, 2 solar panels, and a big 2-meter parabolic antenna. In addition to that, it also had a separate shortwave antenna. And in addition to that, it had a bunch of other smaller antennas mounted on the solar panels. One could say that quite a lot of work had gone into the communications for this spacecraft, so it was rather annoying when all communications failed after 7 days. Still, 7 days had been enough to do some science, so all was not in vain. But as a Venus probe, Venera 1 wasn't quite a success either. It missed Venus by 100,000 kilometers, despite having a course correction system. At that distance, it was felt that, even as a flyby, the mission hadn't gone too well. The first Venus flyby that was actually successful was launched by NASA as part of the Mariner program. Their spacecraft, Mariner 2, came within only 35,000 kilometers from the planet. This was in August the next year, 1962. Not that the Soviets didn't keep trying. In fact, they tried to launch another probe 2 days before the American Mariner, but they again had a failure in the 4th stage of the rocket. They tried again 6 days later, and again they had a failure in the 4th stage of the rocket. They tried for a third time a few days later, and this time the fourth stage didn't fail, because the third stage exploded. With the 1962 train to Venus having left the station, the Soviets turned their eyes back to Mars. In November, they tried 3 times to send a probe to Mars, and this time 3 was the lucky number. Well, luckier. Mars 1 had been similarly equipped for communications as its sister, Venera 1. It kept transmitting for almost 5 months on its way to Mars, until a failure in the antenna orientation system caused a total blackout in communications. However, it had the honor of being the first man-made object sent towards Mars, so the failure wasn't total. The Soviets tried again 3 days later, but a problem caused by vibrations prevented the last stage from engaging, and the spacecraft was stuck on Earth orbit. During the next year, 1963, neither the USA nor the USSR had any attempt to launch to Venus or to Mars. The Soviets sent their Luna 4 to the Moon, which failed to land, and the US military sent a few hundred millions of tiny copper needles into space for some kind of communication experiment. This caused a lot of international protests and became illegal 4 years later, when the Outer Space Treaty was signed. The following year, however, the race to the inner planets resumed, but without much success for either participant. The Soviets tried a flyby mission to Venus in February, but once again liquid oxygen leaked and the rocket fuel froze. They tried again in March, but the upper stage failed and the spacecraft never left Earth orbit. Then again in April, and finally the launch went well, but communications with the spacecraft were lost again. NASA tried for Mars in November 1964, but the Mariner spacecraft didn't separate from the rocket as it should have. They got it right a few weeks later though, when Mariner 4 finally performed the first successful flyby of planet Mars, after traveling for almost 9 months. And with that, NASA won the first flybys for both Venus and Mars. The Soviets also tried again for Venus in the same month, and this time their Venera 2 spacecraft actually did fly all the way to Venus. But the plan had been for it to record all its observations until it came back on the other side, and it could radio everything back to Earth. But that never happened. A broken radiator had failed to cool down the probe enough, and it literally cooked. That meant that no scientific data was returned to Earth. Venera 3, which had been launched 4 days later, actually made it all the way to the atmosphere of Venus, and whatever it found there it didn't like because it immediately stopped transmitting. But despite that, it became the first man-made object to land on another planet, or in this case crash on another planet. It would take the Americans 13 years to land their own thing on Venus. The Soviets met with even more success in 1967, when Venera 4 actually returned data from the atmosphere of Venus. Venera 5 and 6, both of them launched in 1969, both successfully flew all the way from Kazakhstan to the atmosphere of Venus, where they managed to operate for nearly an hour. During this time, NASA was still aiming for Mars, and was able to do 2 more successful flybys with Mariner 6 and 7. The Soviets won a pretty big first in 1970 with the first soft landing on another planet in history. Venera 7 was a half-ton cylinder designed to withstand the huge pressure and temperatures on the surface of Venus. But even the toughest shell couldn't protect it from the rocks that it hit when its parachute didn't open. It impacted Venus at 60 kilometers an hour, and amazingly the recording tapes inside it kept working. But it hit hard, and then it bounced, and then it fell on its side with its antenna aimed incorrectly. Still, the Soviets were able to hear it using an advanced radio telescope. The probe lived for almost an hour and sent back about 20 minutes worth of data. Since nobody had ever seen the surface of Venus because of the clouds, with Venera 7, this was the first time that humans received any observations from there. 2 years later, the Soviets got it even closer, when Venera 8's parachute didn't fail, and it managed a soft landing on Venus in July 1972. But before that success, they had an even bigger one. In 1971, Mars 2 had become the second spacecraft to orbit another planet. It would have been the first, but Mariner 9 had arrived there only 2 weeks earlier. But the Soviet spacecraft also had a lander on board. It was a big metal sphere, over 1 meter in diameter, protected by a braking shield, and equipped with a parachute and landing rockets. The whole thing weighed over a ton, with the actual lander only a quarter of that. It had television cameras on board, and even a small rover that was supposed to move around, tied to the lander with a cable. As it happened, the parachute didn't deploy, and the Mars 2 lander became the first man-made object to impact Mars. With that, the Soviets had gotten even. While NASA claimed the first flybys of both Venus and Mars, the Soviets had the first landings on both planets. Their luck improved with the next mission, which came only a few days after. Mars 3 arrived successfully in orbit, and its lander achieved the first ever soft landing on Mars. It lived for nearly 2 minutes. Nobody knows whether it managed or not to deploy the small rover that it also had. At 25 centimeters, it's far too small to be seen by telescope or from orbit. The first entirely successful Mars lander was the American Viking 1 in 1975. But even more successful was the Soviet Venera 9, which landed on Venus in the same year and gave us the first images ever sent from the surface of another planet. 6 years later, Venera 13 would send us the first sound recording from another planet. The final Soviet missions to Venus happened in 1984, when Vega 1 and Vega 2 not only analyzed the atmosphere on Mars, but actually went a lot farther than that, flying on to investigate Halley's famous comet. Then in 1991 the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and its space program, or whatever was left of it, continued in a totally different form. During its 38 years, it had seen some amazing firsts, like the first man-made object in space, or the first man in space. But as I often mentioned, for example in this episode, the program wasn't always successful. In typical Soviet fashion, failures were quickly airbrushed and repressed. But there were a few setbacks that even the Soviets couldn't cover up, and they will make their way into the next episode of this podcast. This has been an episode of The Soviet Space Saga, a podcast written and produced by me, Alex Deva. If you like the way I tell stories, look up my books on Amazon. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, just send me a message. My website is alxx.se, and you'll find a link to it in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening.